All history is revisionist history. Not only was this the title, but also the main argument made by the historian James Banner Jr. in his essay published by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And frankly, it's something that needed to be said for a while now, because many still don't understand the true nature of history. History is often taught to us as a series of significant events, but seldom do we ever question what makes these events significant or even worthy of being embalmed into an educational, political, or cultural level. Historians, on the other hand, think about this daily. For example, the Declaration of Independence. It's usually taught to us as the catalyst for the American Revolution. But you will definitely find historians who argue that it was the slurry of events, rebellions, and actions that ticked off the Brits and launched both nations into war. But you can also find historians who would argue that it was more the growing distinction of the American identity, which fueled a desire for self governance and thus a need to secede from Britain. That is the true nature of revisionist history. It's not something inherently evil or detrimental to history as we know it, it has its merits. If a historian wants to focus on the roles of Indigenous Americans and their contributions to the Revolutionary War, it doesn't take away from the whole narrative of the war. It actually adds on to it. Because revisionism is just viewing history through a different lens. Figures that we once overlooked can now have their stories told. But like with any academic word introduced to the mainstream media, historical revisionism has quickly been transformed into something it's not. It's become historical denialism, which is the actual denial of historical evidence.
America's historical identity is under attack.
And I won't say I didn't see this coming because we've seen what the anti-wokies did to critical race theory or postmodernism.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory. Critical race theory.
Critical race theorists. Critical race theory. The postmodernists. Marxist political doctrine kept producing evil empires and
However, I will say that historical revisionism does have its downfalls because even though it's currently being used to challenge our orthodoxical way of understanding history, for a long time it's been used to repress the contributions of marginalized groups. And we can especially see this in how Black history has been presented to us for decades. When historians say all history is revisionist history, this includes the history we teach in school. Since childhood, we've been taught that Christopher Columbus was the first to discover the Americas, that the Pilgrims and Indigenous Americans simply came together to create the first Thanksgiving. Then, somewhere down the line, Jamestown popped up and slaves were brought in from Africa to pick cotton. The settlers eventually hated Britain and fought for their independence, which later allowed them to expand westward. But remember those slaves from the 1600s? Well, they were freed following another huge war. And the credit for their freedom goes to the president who viewed them as an inferior race.
I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
Then there was Jim Crow, industrialism, the civil rights movement, a few other wars, and you can see where I'm going with this. But that's all revisionism. Narratives have been excluded from our mainstream understanding of American history, leaving what we have now as a significantly watered down version of American history.
What I'm trying to get across to everyone who considers revisionist history is a number of points. Number one, revisionist history is not a product of the 1960s. It's really been with us since the days of Herodotus and Thucydides 2,500 years ago, and that makes me conclude that it's inherent in historical inquiry, which is what Herodotus and Thucydides themselves together inaugurated that many centuries ago. In the second place, revisionist history, and that is changes in previous interpretations of any part of the past, changes that are brought about by new perspectives, new evidence, new methods, new subjects. Those changes inhabit no particular place on the ideological spectrum. They come from the left and the right. And obviously, it should be clear to all of you that in our day and age, to write a book about revisionist history, and I'll say something additional about it in a minute, is to seem to take issue with the right, which seems to be the location of those who most often attack revisionist history, if only because in the last 50 or 60 years, most of the changes in the history that so many people were brought up with, certainly someone who's my age with my color hair and so on was brought up with, the changes that have come upon our understanding of the past because of the introduction of new subjects, new peoples, new perspectives, new politics, new ideology. Those changes have lodged mostly, but not entirely, on the left. And yet the right, as I try to make clear in the book, and as I'll be happy to try to make further clear this evening, is that the right continues to win a lot of the interpretive battles, if you want to look at them as right or left.
And what's worse is that it seems that any attempt to experiment with the lesser known aspects of Black history, whether through use of historical fiction or historical revisionism, is immediately met with backlash, ridicule, or calls for cancellation. You see, what I find very interesting is that the same folks who love to whip out their overnight PhDs in history are pretty indifferent to historical cinema as a whole, meaning that these people would never discuss the historical inaccuracies of The Last Samurai, but they're ready to provide a full dissertation on African slavery and why the woman king is a danger to Black history. Not once do any of these folks reflect on why such cinematography was able to advance in Hollywood. The Woman King is the first time many people have heard of the Dahomey Nation, revealing that there is a clear deficiency in Black history which would allow anyone, whether it be Hollywood, the literary industry, journalists, or some rando on YouTube, full liberty to fill in the gaps.
You accepted. He taught you were a black heathen, and you believed him. He taught you to worship a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus with white skin, and you believed him.
But the bottom line is, if these people truly cared about Black history, they wouldn't just be taking a reactionary stance. They would instead be proactive and work on ways to bring forth accurate and comprehensive narratives in Black history. But they won't, because they're outrage farmers and complaining is more lucrative than actually suggesting solutions. Which, surprise, surprise, leaves us with the task of examining narratives that contribute to the oversimplification of Black history. Does Black history start with slavery? If you said yes, you may have a case of ahistoricism, because Black people didn't just appear shackled on American soil without origin. Most of us trace back to the African continent and share history with pre-colonial kingdoms. In the same way, colonists didn't appear in America without some prior history with the European metropole. So the question isn't so much about whether or not Black history starts with slavery, it's more about how far back we should go. Personally, I can never get enough of African history, so on an emotional level, there's no such thing as too much of it. But to actually answer the question, I would say we should go back as far as necessary to explain the political and social cultural patterns amongst enslaved communities. Because if we think about it, the same courtesy was afforded to the current narrative of American history. Each aspect of European history we learn draws a direct connection or blatantly inspires the development of American history. From the Greeks, we obtain democracy, and from their intellectualism, the Enlightenment era. Aspects of the Magna Carta inspired many aspects of the American Constitution, specifically the clauses that prevent the rise of a central power or a king. Then there's the Treaty of Westphalia that shapes the international law we know today. And the English Bill of Rights, well, that one's a given. But as you can see, American history was afforded an origin, a very intricate and European one at that. We can easily draw the lines between the influences Europe had in America. But when we begin examining the history of Black Americans, we can't do the same thing. This is what I mean by the oversimplification of Black history. Our current education system marks slavery as the beginning of Black history, implying that enslaved individuals were a blank slate, a people with no understanding of political systems or culture. This blank slate approach can explain why a lot of Black culture and societal patterns are viewed in isolation from the continent. Because if you think Black people's reverence towards their elders is just something inherently Black, you are depriving yourself of examining the role of gerontocracy in ancient West African nations. The same could be said about patterns of West African spiritualism in the diaspora, and the socio-economic structures of maroon societies.
Citizens of Palmares, or Palmaristas, were governed by a king and defended by an organized military.
The overall underdevelopment of Black history has invited a lot of ahistoricism surrounding our origins, specifically from the Hoteps who claim we were all kings and queens back in Africa.
Donations.
But it also has invited revisionist narratives from individuals who champion accuracy only to provide half-truths that support their political argument.
The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other Black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors.
Yeah, the slavery video with Candace Owens does expand upon the narrative to a very small degree. It only does so by providing half-truths. Africans traded slaves with Europeans. True. Africans raided other tribes to facilitate the trade. Also true. But going out of your way to paint slavery as solely a consensual business between Africans and Europeans strips away the true nuances of what happened on the continent. It ignores the history of John Hawkins' raids in the Canary Islands as well as the hundreds of natives he enslaved. It also ignores African abolitionist efforts and any sort of analysis of how slavery wreaked havoc on many kingdoms. King Nzenga Mbemba, who is often referred to by his christened name Alfonso I, usually is viewed as one of the earlier figures in African resistance against slavery. The king of the Congo Empire was mostly characterized by his 24 letters he penned to the king of Portugal, the kingdom who at the time was a large consumer of the Congo slave market. King Alfonso's letters gave a vivid description of his devoutness to Catholicism, even to the extent that he attempted to send those closest to him to Portugal to study the faith. But over time, he began to notice how slavery, the system that was supposed to be a punishment for just prisoners of war and criminals, began to grow into the indiscriminate kidnapping of free Congo people. And it was to which he wrote in a letter,
"And we cannot reckon how great the damage is, since the mentioned merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land, and the sons of our noblemen and vassals and our relatives, because the thieves and men of bad conscience grab them, wishing to have the things and wares of this kingdom which they are ambitious of. They grab them, and get them to be sold. And so great, sir, is the corruption and licentiousness that our country is being completely depopulated, and your highness should not agree with this nor accept it as in your service."
Yet, these narratives are usually ignored by PragerU and channels like them. Painting slavery as solely a trade between powerful Africans and Europeans ignores the actual issues at hand. While some of these trades were consensual, others were deceptive. In King Alfonso's case, he witnessed how vassalage gradually undermined his rule.
"Sir, your highness should know how our kingdom is being lost in so many ways that it is convenient to provide for the necessary remedy, since this is caused by the excessive freedom given by your agents and officials to the men and merchants who are allowed to come to this kingdom to set up shops with goods and many things which have been prohibited by us, and which they spread through our kingdoms and domains in such an abundance that many of our vassals, whom we had in obedience, do not comply because they have the things in greater abundance than we ourselves. And it was with these things that we had them content and subjected under our vassalage and jurisdiction. So it is doing a great harm not only to the service of God but the security and peace of our kingdoms and state as well."
King Alfonso's insistence on Portugal's withdrawal from the slave trade, as well as his call for the end of their exploitation through the vassalage, resulted in a few assassination attempts, but his efforts mark a history of growing discontent between African and European empires. It was this challenge to African sovereignty that even led to the well-known Queen Nzinga to exact war against the Portuguese Empire. And these are just two of the many narratives on the brutality of slavery. It's not to say that these kingdoms weren't at one point complicit in the trade, but it also reveals how destructive the system became when the demand superseded the supply. However, PragerU coincidentally leaps over these narratives only to come to the gracious conclusion that slavery was formally ended by white people in 1833.
After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice.
As if abolition just erupted in Europe without any precursor. As if there definitely wasn't a huge rebellion on an island somewhere. As if there wasn't a massacre where all the slaves were thrown off a ship so the crew can pull a big insurance scam. And then there definitely wasn't a huge trial following that scam which brought abolitionists to the forefront. Racialized slavery definitely did not exist well into the 19th century, because Europe said so.
We've been taught that slavery was a long time ago, get over it, which is something nearly every black person in this country hears at some point.
I'm not gonna lie, when the 1619 Project was first announced, I didn't really know much about it, apart from the overall premise that American history was shaped by the arrival of slaves in 1619, and that seemed to be the narrative that much of mainstream ran off with.
Around the audacious claim that our true founding is 1619, not 1776.
But the 1619 Project, after doing some research, is actually an anthology comprised of art, essays, poems, and even fiction. These works was curated by the New York Times and spearheaded by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Through its popularity, or rather infamy, it grew into a podcast, school curriculum, and even a children's book. It was created with the intention of analyzing how slavery and racism shaped the America we know today. But something we seem to ignore was that the project itself was as much of a journalistic endeavor as it was a historical one. So, in a sense, we shouldn't really be surprised that there was an ideological drive behind it, despite it being written as an expose. But this is undoubtedly still revisionist history, not only of Black America, but the nation as a whole.
The purpose of the 1619 Project is not to teach history, but to propagandize.
And the 1619 Project is really saying that slavery was so foundational to America and its institutions that we are still suffering from that legacy now, and it's exploring the many ways that we still are.
Think about it. Our schools do not require us to analyze racism's after effects, leaving many to believe that we've achieved perfection after the Civil Rights Act. This could be the reason why many are unable to conceptualize the argument that America is a racist nation. We're glossing over atrocities that victimize minorities and the laws enacted to prevent them from achieving equality, rather giving most of our attention to the outcomes, which are the 3 amendments and the Civil Rights Act, then using them as an excuse to say everything is fine now. Nicole focuses on these issues in her essay, opening up with a personal story about her family's experience in America and how her father's connection to Mississippi sharecroppers shaped her family's relationship with the country. She discusses how Black Americans were treated in the country despite their contributions to many historic milestones. She even recognizes aspects of Black history that aren't taught in schools, such as the Nader period. This era is often presented to us as just Jim Crow, but it was actually marked by a reversal of a lot of assimilation policies enacted following the Civil War, and historians even argue that it was at this period that race relations were at their worst. The same Republican Party that championed racial equality turned against Black people out of fear. Nicole has a lot to say in her essay, from uncovering the tragedies many Blacks experienced to exposing how America inspired Nazi Germany. She highlights a lot of Black history that needs to come to the forefront. But she also makes the same mistake that plagues much of our understanding of Black history, and that is severing Black history from Africa.
The teal eternity of the Atlantic Ocean had severed them so completely from what had once been their home that it was as if nothing had ever existed before, as if everything and everyone they cherished had simply vanished from the earth. They were no longer Mbundu or Akan or Fulani.
When she erases the African origins of enslaved people, she unfortunately contributes to the same simplification of Black history that she aimed to challenge in this essay. Like I said before, Black people and our culture did not just emerge in a vacuum. And it's highly likely that much more research has been forgone due to the narratives pushing the idea that Black history began at the Atlantic Sea, or in America. So the question still remains, how should Black history begin? If we were to trace the origins of every Black American, specifically those whose ancestors were slaves in the United States, the lead would take us all along Africa's west coast, from Senegal all the way down to Angola. And frankly, that's a lot of history. Like, who has the time to go to Ghana? Ghana, the empire, not the country, was actually one of the 3 eldest kingdoms along the Bilad al-Sudan, an Arabic name meaning the land of blacks. Its founding is currently unknown, but it's believed to have emerged around the 8th century and disbanded around the 1200s. As an empire, it was divided between the metropolitan nucleus and its outer provincial regions, which were composed of a mix of conquered regions and vassal states, some of which even had their own kings. You can think of this system as something similar to federalism. We have our governors for each state, but at the head of the nation, and the person who calls most of the shots, is the president. So you may be wondering how multiple kings are able to function under one nation. Well, sources claim that the king simply removed and appointed vassal rulers, but there was also a system instilled that required rulers to send their sons to the capital to become the king's security. The metropolitan region of the empire consisted of the capital, Kumbi Saleh, and what is particularly interesting about this capital is the fact that it was a physical representation of the empire's religious pluralism. Literally divided into 2 regions, Kumbi Saleh had a Muslim section and a non-Muslim section. The king resided on the non-Muslim side, allowing him the liberty to practice traditional African spirituality. And of course, as with the entire world, slavery was very much present in the Ghana Empire. Slavery was so commonplace and enmeshed in the system that it's not really discussed in sources apart from the trade with northern Islamic nations and the existence of eunuchs in Islamic societies. But you know what is mentioned constantly in the empire's history? Gold.
The king adorns himself like a woman, wearing necklaces around his neck and bracelets on his forearms, and he puts on a high cap decorated with gold and wrapped in a turban of fine cotton. He sits in audience or to hear grievances against officials in a domed pavilion, around which stand 10 horses covered with gold-embroidered materials. Behind the king stand 10 pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold. And on his right are the sons of the vassal kings of his country, wearing splendid garments and their hair plated with gold.
Unsurprisingly, it's this display of wealth that made the Ghana Empire a target. Following multiple raids by the Almoravids of North Africa and the internal wars between Muslims and African traditionalists, the empire disbanded, giving way to a much larger and predominantly Muslim Mali Empire. You know, I think they still teach about Mali in primary school because I do recall learning about Mansa Musa in 1st or 2nd grade. So it's kind of surprising that a lot of people didn't know that this man was rich as hell.
This Moorish ruler is named Mansa Musa, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea. This king is the richest and most distinguished ruler of this whole region on account of the great quantity of gold that is found in his lands.
But Mali was officially formed around the end of the Ghana Empire, so around 1300 CE. Mansa Musa, who succeeded the throne after multiple unremarkable rulers, expanded Mali's territorial control, cultural influence, and trade economy. Mali somewhat had a monopoly on trade routes, acting as a bridge between nations in the northern Sahara Desert and those past the Niger River. Bottom line is, Timbuktu remains one of the most influential cities in history. Initially founded by the Tuaregs as a small trading hub, it became Mali's central trading center and a cradle for intellectualism and the Islamic faith. Islam was able to spread across Western Africa with the help of Timbuktu and Mansa Musa I, who became a devout Muslim himself after his voyage to the Mecca. So what happened to Mali? Well, there was a structural issue with the empire. Mali lacked proper succession rules, and men were constantly fighting for the title of Mansa, leading to multiple civil wars. Then there was the rise of competing trade routes from other nations. The Europeans were beginning to figure out how to navigate Africa's west coast, leaving them to rely less and less on the Sahara routes for trade. Then there were multiple attacks by the Tuaregs, who, for lack of a better explanation, probably wanted Timbuktu back. And finally, with the help of Sunni Ali, the neighboring Songhai kingdom took over a large portion of Mali, leaving the rest under the rule of the Moroccan kingdom. Songhai actually existed throughout the Mali Empire, but only as a polity. It grew and overtook Mali because of the former empire's destabilization. What made Songhai notable was its strong centralized government in which the king was an absolute monarch with hundreds of eunuchs. But this actually did little to counter the instability that came with succession because 6 out of the 9 kings were assassinated. And Songhai's eventual loss of control in the gold trade is what led to the rise of Askias. Askia Muhammad was a commander before he usurped the throne from Sunni Ali's son, Sunni Barrow. With his newfound power, he expanded the Songhai Empire until it nearly covered the entire Niger River. Muhammad also solidified Islamic influence by enacting Islamic law in the empire. He appointed qadis, Islamic magistrates, to various towns and employed Islamic officials in his government. This led to the rise and expansion of the Muslim elite urban class, but despite the growth of Islam throughout Songhai, it didn't become the empire's official religion due to significant presence of African traditionalists in Songhai's rural population. Askia Muhammad marked the pinnacle of the Songhai Empire, as following his death, the nation failed to maintain a steady leadership and quell internal conflicts. This eventually allowed the Moroccans, with their advanced weaponry acquired from European suppliers, to whittle Songhai down into nothing by the 17th century. So by now you may be thinking, wow, these are some very interesting African kingdoms, and it's super interesting how Islam was able to spread throughout Western Africa. But what does this have to do with Black history in the Americas? And to that I say, who were the first Muslims in America? Because PragerU and the 1619 Project doesn't cover this kind of Black history, and Islam is only discussed as a vehicle for the Black Power movement in the 60s. But the reality is, Islam existed in America ever since African explorers accompanied Spanish expeditions. Even around 30% of their enslaved counterparts were Muslim. While yes, many were forcibly converted to Christianity, but there were those who kept their practice under wraps until emancipation. The presence of Islamic slaves isn't just about religion either. A lot, if not all, were literate, meaning they could read and write, and because those slaves possessed an intelligence and were more likely to be skilled in trades, they were viewed as valuable but also dangerous to the status quo.
His literacy and culture completely goes against, abolishes, one might say, annihilates the narrative that slaves were not capable of culture. In fact, they were persons with distinct histories, abilities, culture, and background.
He was wealthy, and he was highly educated, because in his autobiography he speaks about spending 25 years studying.
Of course, African history isn't isolated to the main kingdoms. In fact, those kingdoms weren't even the main exporters of enslaved people who were brought to the Americas. Most of the slave trade exports came from the Wolof Kingdom, the Kingdom of Benin, the Oyo Empire, the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Ashanti Empire, and even to a greater extent, the Congo Kingdom. But you can even see examples of how enslaved people's culture was brought with them from their homelands. Remember the Gullah people of the Carolinas I mentioned earlier? Well, there are aspects of Wolof embedded in their culture. Voodoo is directly derived from Benin and other West African cultures. Capoeira, a Brazilian martial art which was practiced by enslaved populations, has its origins in the Congo Kingdom, or modern-day Angola. Even the well-known Palmares, the Brazilian maroon colony in Pernambuco, was structured based on African societies. And enslaved rice farmers practiced the same agricultural methods used in the societies along the West African coast. Look, I'll give credit where credit is due and say that Black history has made some decent strides, but we can definitely go further. And by further, I mean allowing Black history to begin on the continent of Africa and exploring how African cultures influence dynamics amongst enslaved societies, as well as the knowledge and skills retained by enslaved people. So, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe, because the tragic oversimplification of Black history is going to be a series. It's just that there was so much to cover that I couldn't fit into one video. But I also have some other topics on history that I want to cover, as well as some topics on society and pop culture. But for now, that is all. Until next time.